Hey, welcome to Grace No Recordings. In this video, we're going to convert this old Silvertone Tombstone style radio into a Fender Champ with the classic 5F1 circuit. One thing that really drew me to this Tombstone style radio is the fact that it can house an 8-inch speaker inside and make this a combo amp. I'm craving a standalone amp that I can take out of the studio and not have to worry about a separate cabinet. Normally when I'm using an amp head in my studio, I connect it to this built-in speaker cabinet I built into this desk, which works really well for lower watt amps. If you're interested in that video, I'll post a link down in the description and at the end of this video. With that in mind, let's begin the teardown. If you were like me as a kid, you loved taking things apart and figuring out how they worked. I get the same feeling every time I do a project like this, especially when there's a mix of electrical and mechanical components like this tuner mechanism. This is the real centerpiece of this radio, and I have a really unique idea of how I'm going to integrate this into the amp build. Unfortunately, there aren't any electrical components in here that are of any use for this build. While some people may be drawn to use some of them like these old capacitors or something, I would advise against it. Even if they show signs of life, such as not shorting out, they're just a ticking time bomb and will put your whole amp at risk of damage. These components aren't that expensive, so I recommend just getting new ones that will be more reliable and have tighter tolerances. Plus, since I'm building to the specific 5F1 circuit and want the result to be close to the original, I want to use component values that match the schematic and not just use what I happen to find in here. If you're interested in building an amp using as much of the original electronics as possible, check out this video on my recommendations linked below. Now that everything is torn down, let's get this chassis all cleaned up and see what we're working with. A simple once-over with some sandpaper and a wire brush was enough to clean up the surface rust and will allow for solid ground connections when we solder up the circuit. As I mentioned earlier, my plan for this tuner mechanism is to turn this into the volume indicator, but I'll need to be really creative with how to do this. Now, most people think that radios are tuned to different frequencies using variable resistance, but they're actually tuned using variable capacitance. That's what this contraption basically does. It's mechanically changing the capacitance using these rotating plates. The rotation changes how much of these plates are overlapping each other and thus changing the resonant frequency of the filters and effectively changing the radio station that you're listening to. So, while I can't use this mechanism to change the volume directly because volume is changed using resistance, I need to find some way to connect it to a potentiometer. In a future project, it may be cool to use a variable capacitor like this in an amp tone circuit, but I'm trying to keep this build relatively simple. In order to make this all work correctly, two things have to happen. First, and most important, the radio knob turns 2.5 times to move this indicator wheel to its maximum range, and a standard amp potentiometer turns about 5/6 of a turn. I need to connect them together in such a way where the 2.5 turns of the radio knob matches the 5/6 of a turn of the potentiometer. And to do this, I'm going to use spur gears. If I didn't use a gear reduction and simply did a 1-to-1 gear ratio, I'd only be using this much of the indicator wheel, and it would be really hard to differentiate between the different volume settings. I'd have to cram all the numbers in that small area. So, to make it more aesthetic, I'm going to use a gear reduction which will allow me to use the full range of this indicator wheel. Second, I'm going to remake this faceplate to show the current volume setting on the amp, which we'll get into after getting the gears to work. This was the first time I used a 3D printed part in an amp build, and it was really rewarding to go through the design and prototyping process to get a result that worked really well. At first, I was worried that these wouldn't be strong enough, especially because this whole mechanism takes some effort to turn. But all the force is happening between the radio knob and the tuning mechanism, and the plastic gears aren't actually doing really any work with any significant force, just moving the potentiometer, which turns really easily. Also, there are mechanical stops built into this mechanism which will prevent the system from overturning and breaking one of these gears. Of note, I'm going to mount the potentiometer backwards so that turning the volume down actually turns the potentiometer down and vice versa. So at this point, we have the original knob coupled to the volume pot, both turning to their full capacity. Now I'm going to design the new faceplate, which will indicate the volume setting that the amp is turned to. After taking some quick measurements, I hopped on Lightburn and designed a simple faceplate. The laser engraver is one of my favorite tools to use on a build because it provides really creative and unique features. It can add character to a normally mundane piece of the amp, such as this volume indicator. After adding some finish and letting it dry, we're ready to assemble it back up and make sure it all works. I'm really happy with the results of this volume mechanism and excited for the rest of the build. While it took a lot of work up front to get this project going, the rest should go a lot smoother. So stay tuned for the next video where we'll begin installing all of the electronics. Thanks for watching.